I was 9 years old when my parents decided I was no longer worth keeping. It was a cold October afternoon, the kind where the sky hung low and gray, threatening rain. I stood in the hallway of our small house, clutching my faded blue backpack, while my mother shoved my clothes into 2 black trash bags. She moved quickly, angrily, as if she couldn't wait to get rid of me. My father stood by the front door, arms crossed, his face blank and impatient. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Did I do something wrong?" Neither of them answered. At 9 years old, I had already learned that silence was often worse than yelling. Silence meant they had already made up their minds. My little brother Ethan sat on the couch in the living room, watching cartoons and eating cookies. He didn't even look at me. Ever since he'd been born 3 years earlier, everything had changed. Before Ethan, my parents had tolerated me. After him, I became an inconvenience. "Mom," I said again, tears filling my eyes, "I'll be better, I promise." My mother finally turned to face me. Her sharp green eyes, the same color as mine, were cold. "This isn't about being better," she snapped. "We can't deal with your behavior anymore." I was confused. I had never caused trouble. I kept my room clean, got good grades, and stayed quiet to avoid upsetting them. But none of it ever seemed enough. My father grabbed the trash bags and motioned toward the door. "Get in the car." The ride to Grandpa's house felt endless. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window as rain began tapping against the glass. My stomach twisted with fear. Grandpa lived across town in a large brick house surrounded by old oak trees. We visited only on holidays because my father rarely spoke to him. No one said a word during the drive. When we finally pulled into Grandpa's driveway, my mother turned around in her seat. "You're staying here for a while," she said flatly. "How long?" I asked. She didn't answer. My father got out, yanked my trash bags from the trunk, and marched to the front door. I followed slowly, my legs shaking. Grandpa answered after the second knock. He was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with quiet authority. Even at 72, his sharp brown eyes noticed everything. He looked from my father to me, then to the trash bags sitting at his feet. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. My father cleared his throat. "Ryan's become too difficult to manage. We think it's best if he stays with you for a while." Grandpa's gaze landed on my tear-streaked face. "Is that so?" My mother folded her arms. "We've made our decision." For a long moment, Grandpa said nothing. Then he stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come inside, Ryan." I hesitated, glancing back at my parents. I expected my mother to hug me. I expected my father to tell me this wasn't permanent. Instead, they turned and walked back to the car without another word. I stood frozen as their taillights disappeared into the rain. The ache in my chest was so sharp I could barely breathe. Grandpa placed a warm hand on my shoulder. "You don't need to stand out here, son." That single word, son, broke something inside me. I burst into tears. Grandpa knelt beside me and pulled me into his arms. He held me as I sobbed, his voice steady and calm. "You're safe here," he said. That night, sitting in the guest room with clean sheets and warm light spilling from the bedside lamp, I stared at the rain sliding down the window. I didn't know it then, but that was the last night I would ever wait for my parents to come back for me. And it was the first night of the life Grandpa was about to give me. The first few weeks at Grandpa's house felt strange, like I had stepped into someone else's life. I kept expecting my parents to come back for me. Every time the phone rang, I would glance toward it with hope. Every time headlights flashed through the front windows at night, my heart would race. I imagined my mother walking through the front door with tears in her eyes, apologizing for everything. I imagined my father telling me it had all been a terrible mistake. But the calls never came. The driveway remained empty. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand the truth. They hadn't left me with Grandpa because they needed time. They had left me because they didn't want me anymore. Grandpa never forced me to talk about that day. Instead, he gave me something I had never truly known before: patience. Every morning, he made pancakes shaped like animals, even though his cooking was clumsy and uneven. He drove me to school himself, always reminding me to keep my chin up. In the evenings, we sat in his library surrounded by towering shelves of old books while he helped me with homework. For the first time in my life, someone cared whether I was happy. The house itself felt alive with warmth. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen every morning. Soft jazz played from Grandpa's old record player. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed every hour like a steady reminder that life kept moving forward. Little by little, the emptiness inside me began to heal. At school, my grades improved. I made friends. I joined the debate team after Grandpa insisted I had the mind of a future leader. "You're far stronger than you know, Ryan," he often told me. His words became the foundation I built myself upon. Still, there were moments when questions haunted me. Why had my parents abandoned me so easily? What had I done to deserve it? The answer came when I was 13. That evening, I had gone downstairs for a glass of water when I heard voices drifting from Grandpa's study. The door was slightly open. I recognized my father's voice immediately. "You're being unreasonable," he said sharply. Grandpa's tone was cold and controlled. "No, Daniel, I'm being cautious. He's our son," my mother snapped. "You owe this family." There was a long pause before Grandpa spoke again. "The day you abandoned that boy on my doorstep, you forfeited the right to call yourselves his parents." My breath caught. I stood frozen in the hallway. My father's voice rose. "We did what we had to do. You refused to help us financially. We thought if Ryan stayed here, you'd finally loosen your grip on your money." The world tilted beneath me. It wasn't because I was difficult. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough. They had used me. My mother's voice came next, cold and bitter. "You always favored him anyway." Grandpa's response was immediate. "I favored decency, something neither of you seem capable of." I stumbled backward before they could see me, my chest tight with disbelief. That night, I sat on my bed, staring into darkness as tears streamed silently down my face. Everything I had spent years blaming myself for had been a lie. The next morning, Grandpa knocked gently on my door. He sat beside me without speaking for a moment. "You heard us last night," he said quietly. I nodded. He sighed deeply. "I wanted to tell you when you were older. Your parents thought abandoning you here would pressure me into giving them access to my estate. Why didn't you?" "Because some lessons must be learned the hard way." He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a small brass key. "What's this?" I asked. "A safety deposit box key," he said. "Inside are documents that explain everything. Someday, when the time is right, you'll understand why I've protected them." I stared at the key in my trembling hand. Then Grandpa placed his hand over mine. "They may have abandoned you, Ryan," he said firmly, "but they also made the greatest mistake of their lives." At 13, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Years later, I would. By the time I turned 24, Grandpa was more than the man who had raised me. He was my family, my mentor, and the reason I had become the person I was. Under his guidance, I had graduated at the top of my class, earned a law degree, and returned home to help manage the charitable foundation he had built over decades. He often joked that I was the son he had always hoped for, and every time he said it, I felt a warmth no memory of my parents could ever replace. For years, my parents had remained little more than ghosts. Occasionally, a birthday card would arrive with stiff signatures and no real message. Sometimes my mother would leave a short voicemail pretending she wanted to reconnect, but Grandpa always warned me to be careful. People driven by greed rarely change. He would say, I wanted to believe he was wrong. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was late November when Grandpa collapsed in his study. I was reviewing case files in the next room when I heard the crash. By the time I reached him, he was on the floor, pale and struggling to breathe. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The diagnosis was devastating: advanced heart failure. The doctors told us he had months, perhaps less. Though Grandpa remained calm, the news shook me to my core. I spent every spare moment at his side, helping with medications, attending appointments, and pretending not to notice how much weaker he grew each day. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, my parents returned. The first time I saw them standing in Grandpa's hospital room, I barely recognized them. My father's hair had gone gray at the temples. and my mother's face was tight with carefully maintained youth. Yet their expressions were painfully familiar, polished smiles hiding selfish intentions. "Ryan," my mother said softly, arms opening as if she expected an embrace. I stepped back. "What are you doing here?" Her smile faltered. "We came as soon as we heard about your grandfather." "Our father," my father corrected sharply. Grandpa, lying weakly in his hospital bed, let out a dry laugh. "Funny," he said. "You didn't seem interested in family for the last 15 years. The tension in the room thickened. My father ignored the comment and turned to me. "We know there's been distance between us, son, but this is a chance to heal." The word son made my stomach twist. For the next several weeks, they played their roles perfectly. They brought flowers, they spoke gently to nurses. They told anyone who would listen how deeply they cared. To outsiders, they looked like devoted children supporting their dying father and reconnecting with their estranged son. But behind closed doors, their masks slipped. One evening, I entered Grandpa's study to find my father standing by the safe. "What are you doing?" I demanded. He jumped, "Just looking for some paperwork." Step away from the safe. His face hardened instantly. "You always were dramatic." Another time, I overheard my mother speaking sharply into her phone. "If he signs the revised documents before he dies, we're secure," she hissed. The pieces clicked into place. They hadn't come back for reconciliation. They had come for Grandpa's money. When I told Grandpa what I'd heard, he wasn't surprised. Instead, he gave me a calm, knowing smile. I expected this. He motioned for me to open the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a sealed envelope marked with my name. "There's also another copy with Mr. Whitmore," he said, referring to his longtime lawyer. "What is this? Protection?" I frowned. "From what?" "From them." He leaned back, exhaustion shadowing his face. "Years ago, after they abandoned you, I began documenting everything. Every conversation, every demand for money, every threat." I stared at him. "You recorded them," he nodded, "and I instructed my lawyer to act the moment they tried to challenge what belongs to you." A chill ran through me. "What exactly did you do?" Grandpa's eyes glinted with quiet determination. "I made certain that when the time comes, their greed will destroy them." A week later, my parents announced they were arranging a family meeting with lawyers to discuss Grandpa's estate. They smiled confidently, already imagining their victory. What they didn't know was that Grandpa had already planned their defeat, and his lawyer was ready to deliver the final blow. Grandpa passed away 3 days before Christmas. The house felt unbearably silent after the funeral. For 15 years, his steady presence had filled every room with warmth and purpose. Now all that remained were memories, the faint scent of his pipe tobacco in the library, and the crushing ache of knowing I would never hear his voice again. Despite my grief, I knew there was one final responsibility left to fulfill, the reading of Grandpa's will. It was scheduled for the following Monday at the office of his longtime attorney, Harold Whitmore. Grandpa had trusted him for over 30 years, and if there was one thing I knew, it was that Grandpa never placed his trust lightly. When I arrived, my parents were already seated in the conference room. My mother wore a black designer dress and a carefully practiced expression of sorrow. My father sat rigidly beside her, his fingers drumming impatiently against the polished oak table. The moment they saw me, my mother offered a false smile. "Ryan," she said sweetly, "no matter what happens today, we're still family." I said nothing. Her smile tightened. Mr. Whitmore entered carrying a thick leather folder. He was a sharp-eyed man in his 60s, calm and composed, with the kind of presence that commanded immediate silence. He took his seat at the head of the table and adjusted his glasses. "Thank you all for coming," he said. My father leaned forward. "Let's get this over with." Whitmore gave him a long, unreadable look before opening the folder. "We will begin with a personal letter from your father, addressed to all present." He unfolded a single sheet of paper and began to read. "If you are hearing this, then my time has ended. To my grandson Ryan, you were the greatest blessing of my life. Your strength, integrity, and kindness restored my faith in family." My throat tightened. Whitmore continued. "To Daniel and Claire, your actions 15 years ago revealed your true character. You abandoned your son as leverage for financial gain, believing I would reward cruelty with inheritance." My mother's face drained of color. "That's absurd," she snapped. Whitmore raised a hand. "I advise you to remain silent." He continued reading. "Because I anticipated your return when my health declined, I prepared evidence documenting every attempt you made to manipulate, threaten, and deceive me." My father shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous." Without reacting, Whitmore pressed a button on the conference room remote. A screen descended from the wall behind him. Then the recordings began. My father's voice filled the room. "If you don't transfer part of the estate, we'll drag this through court." Another clip followed. My mother's cold voice echoed. "Ryan was useful. Leaving him with you was the only way to force your hand." The room went deathly silent. My mother's hands trembled. My father lunged forward. "This is illegal." "It is entirely legal," Whitmore said coolly. "Your father obtained all recordings lawfully." Then came the final revelation. Whitmore removed another document. "Under the terms of Judge Bennett's revised estate plan, all assets, including this home, his investments, and his foundation shares, pass solely to Ryan Bennett." My breath caught. My mother let out a strangled gasp. "No," she whispered, "Whitmore wasn't finished." In addition, Judge Bennett filed a civil action prior to his death. Based on documented abandonment, financial coercion, and fraudulent intent, both of you are permanently barred from contesting this will. My father's face turned crimson. "You can't do this." Whitmore's expression hardened. "It has already been done." He slid one final envelope across the table toward me. "Your grandfather asked me to give you this after proceedings concluded." With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. "Justice is not revenge, Ryan. It is truth revealed. Live the life they never believed you could build." Tears blurred my vision. Across the table, my parents sat shattered, exposed, and defeated. Their greed had destroyed them exactly as Grandpa promised. As security escorted them from the building, my mother looked back at me with desperate regret, but it was too late. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free. Grandpa's final gift was never his fortune. It was the justice that silenced them forever.